Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, Jim Seibert, and Barry Harrison, and the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast is made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Driving the Line, the podcast that's always in the pursuit of safety. I am Jim Seibert, and I am a solo act today, but I have a special guest with me. But before I get to her, let me highlight the fact that we're sitting in June right now, and it is National Safety Month, put on by the National Safety Council, which is America's leading nonprofit safety advocate. And they focus on eliminating the leading causes of preventable injuries and deaths. Every year, every June since 1996, the National Safety Council has provided a focused program, training materials to its members and the public to take part in and help their employees with weekly topics through June. So this year's weekly focus is continuous improvement for week 1. Week 2 covers employee engagement. Week 3, roadway safety. And the last week of June is on well-being. So to push you all towards their website, ncs.org, they've got loads of information and a lot of free safety resources to use there. So without further ado, I am joined today by Director Vicki Kramer with the Nebraska Department of Transportation. Vicki, Director Kramer, welcome to Driving the Line. I'm so thankful to have you here visiting with me. And just to kind of give a little background, our listeners know that I'm a pretty fierce patriot, and I bring up my time in the service. I use some safety examples of my time in the service, and you are as well. And I want to thank you for your service right now before we get into the topics. But can you give me just a little bit of your military background? What was your job? When did you get out? What could you share that maybe led you to the position that you're in?
Sure. Well, thank you. And first, thank you for allowing me to be here, especially during National Safety Month. It is so important, and it's something that the Nebraska DOT in the last 2.5 years has really tried to have a renewed focus around safety. And so I very much appreciate the podcast bringing attention to how we can be safer on our roads and how it's everyone's responsibility. But personally, being here, it's good to reconnect. I think the one thing that will stick with most of us who have ever served is just the people and the relationships that you are able to establish and the connections. And to me, that doesn't just lend itself to the military, but also to public service. And I've been lucky enough to be able to serve the people of Nebraska, whether it be on the federal side. I started my career, my first boss was Chuck Hagel. And so if you know anything about the United States Senate and the military or Nebraska, you know that Chuck Hagel is a very strong patriot as well. And it really, it was at a time in my life where I got to see what public service could do. It was during the time where they were passing the GI Bill, and you could see the impact of, the people my age it was having on them. They had, graduated school, didn't know what they wanted to do. Signed up for the military and went off to war. And many of them were gone for years, multiple deployments back to back. It was a hard time. And that was between 2008 and 2011. And so for me, it was, you're seeing it in the policy world. You're doing your best. I had the opportunity to join Chuck Hagel's full-time staff right out of school. And then I moved over to Mike Johan's staff and did military and veterans affairs for him as his United States, when he was a United States senator. And it was just eye-opening how much our generation was giving. And I wanted to be a part of that. And so when I was 24, so pretty much geriatric basic training. and enlisted, and have never once regretted it. It was the best part of my life. Basic training was probably one of the best times because as a small town kid from Nebraska, I just not had the opportunity to see what else is out there and what other kind of people were. And I look back at that time and it really made me a better leader when you look at the empathy that you find from where people come from and understand how to connect with people. And so, joined the Nebraska National Guard, did basic training, went straight through OCS, the whole time working for the Senate and working directly for Major General Lemke, retired at the time, who was Mike Johan's military affairs rep. And so I always joke that I have no excuse for not knowing the right thing to do because of the amazing mentors I've had. General Lemke and then later General Bohack are two wonderful examples of leadership and how to walk the line of a military leader and really make sure that you are doing what you're saying and that your team that follows you understands that. And so did that for a couple years and 6 years or so, and then moved over to Senator Deb Fischer's staff and got to work for her for a little under a year, and then went full-time military for a couple of years. Was just at the time where I was thinking that I kind of knew what I was doing, even though I was a lieutenant working directly for a 2-star general in the policy world. And, anybody who understands rank knows that is not normal. And, learned so much from the team at the Nebraska National Guard. And, the Nebraska DOT called and said, hey, we've got these 2 jobs and we're trying to figure out, can we bring somebody in who maybe could do them both? And, they called again and had the opportunity to talk with Mickey Esposito at the time and Kyle Schneeweiss. And I was like, you know what? I think I want to take this. I think I want to try something else. Because I'd done military and vets affairs for 10 years and national security policy and really kind of knew what the future looked like for that. And if I was going to roll the dice, now's the time, right?
Yeah.
And so moved over to DOT, 4 months pregnant with orders to deploy in a year. And they took a gamble on me, and I dug in quickly, learned the policy world. When I talk with my team at DOT, it's the one thing I say is we can teach you anything, but you have to have a heart of service. You have to want to learn, and you have to understand that though we have a ton of professionals, we've got close to 2,000 staff within the DOT. It's not their job completely to teach you. When we bring new staff in, especially at the middle management to senior management level, there has to be a dedication for them to learn. And, I have these binders all over my home office where it's from 2019 to 2022, just studying transportation and reading the law, reading the policy, understanding the policy, because everything in transportation is 10 years. And so you can go back and you can see the things that were talked about 10 years ago and the projects that were talked about finally kind of getting built. Now, love the opportunity to address that, but we haven't had real permitting reform or environmental reform that's changed that. And so the benefit is you can learn it pretty fast if you want to dig in and learn.
You brought up something that in the service we were taught this leadership acronym, right? Loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. That selfless service, I wrote down here sacrificial service, and then I'm like, no, it's not sacrificial. It's a selfless service that's kind of on the cusp of that. And it seems like you've really bounced around, ran the gamut, and this is not anywhere close to a political podcast, but we would be pretty remiss if we didn't say that the things that we discuss are directly influenced by politics. And you navigating that world on 2 sides is extremely interesting to me because the military can be very political. It tickled me when you were mentioning the names because yeah, I'm a Nebraska kid, born and raised South Central Nebraska, a little town of Axtell, population 738. I gave him a little shout out there. I've lived in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, now back to Oklahoma. That's because I married an Oklahoma girl, and so therefore I live in Oklahoma. But those names, they ring a bell with me, and I've watched them across the news, and you and I overlapped just a touch in our service. I knew who you were, don't know if you knew who I was, but I believe that our paths crossed on kind of a special state mission of SURF-P at the time, which is a chemical related function. And don't ask me to spell any of that, folks, because you'll laugh at me. But we crossed paths there, and we connected on LinkedIn. And it's such a broad background where your selfless service has gone from political eye to political parties, but the focus has always been towards a centralized mission. And that mission of you being the director of DOT today is one of these things that I'd like to dissect for our listeners. And just to tell you a little bit about our audience, we're talking the owners of these trucking companies, and we're talking to the safety directors of them. And we've got some great folks, the truck drivers, that listen to us. And we love the truck drivers as much as we love our customer base here. So you've explained quite a bit of your background and your motivation to get where you are today. We can move beyond that. Do you have any key experiences or things that shaped your approach to the leadership of Nebraska DOT?
I think it's a culmination of everything that's come together. I was very nervous about coming back to the DOT because I had actually left for about 2.5 years and gone to the private sector, to the construction side. And that was really, I think, staying on trend with what led me from one position to the other is, I started out heavy on policy to where you're essentially making laws to fix a situation. And what I really wanted to understand as, someone young in their career is what's the ability of leadership to change it before it gets to the point where you have to change the law? Can you change the policy in your own organization? How much does leadership impact the ability to be successful versus having to create law? Because there are so many variables that you can't control when it gets to law. And so how do you solve problems at the lowest common denominator? How do you actually make sure that your stakeholders and those that are going through it with you, and if it's both sides, we just had an issue with the dairy haulers who they wanted to run a legislative bill. And it was at the point where it was like, hey, we can't support this, but I think what you're trying to do is this. And so through that coordination, we were able to actually avoid creating a bill where we were on two different sides of it. And we created a bill that was like, hey, in order to do this, we would actually need this in statute. So let's do it like this. And so I think that there are a lot of different ways that you can pull from just the foundations of leadership, right? Listening. It's the problem solving piece. I get asked a lot about my age because I am the youngest DOT secretary in the country. And to me, I think it's helpful because I do not know what I don't know. And how can I be expected to know something that's 30, somebody 30 years my senior is typically charged with. And so, we work hand in hand as DOTs to make sure that we can identify trends and leadership tactics and theory and ways to solve things before they get to law, if possible. And one of the areas I've really enjoyed doing that is taking some of my background for military. Like I enjoyed SURF-P a lot, and it's incredibly necessary as we look at the threats that we have within the environment right now. We need to be able to understand how to respond to chemical and biological issues. And with that, we also need to understand, and COVID taught us this, how does our transportation system affect our ability to respond within emergency management? And so I chair our national, we have ASHA, which is the Association of State Highways. I chair our committee on transportation security and system resilience. And so what we're as an organization really looking at, we're working with the emergency managers of every state, as well as some of their resilient staff to understand, are we putting the right level of emphasis on our transportation system in terms of its contributions to national defense? Should we be thinking about it differently? Are we standardized? We've got the World Cup coming in. What kind of a threat does that bring next year? Freight movement, our freight as it moves throughout our roadways. What are the biggest bottlenecks? I just did an interview with trucking, one of those trucking associations, talking about what are the biggest, top 20 bottlenecks. Well, Nebraska doesn't have any. Oklahoma doesn't either. But what are those? Maybe it was, I don't know if Oklahoma does. They might outside of Oklahoma City. But what can we use to address? Because we can't build our way out of it. So it's taking those principles of leadership and really trying to dig in to understand, okay, what are the problems? Understanding, like you said, there's politics, right? And we're not in the same environment we were a year ago. So what are the options to get out of it? And it's got to be a mixture of technology. It's got to be a mixture of public-private partnerships. And it's got to understand what are the capacities to build our way out of it. But it has to come back to that root problem of capacity. And we've got to agree upon a data set that is the real problem set. And so for me, as I look at what are the principles of leadership that I learned from the military, the things that I was taught, the agile thinking, without that development, without a lot of the mentorship that I got along the way, there's no way that I would be able to deal with the transportation environment, because it is so dynamic and the stakeholders are so diverse. The freight community versus, the disadvantaged communities. Like, you have to be able to explain that freight and safety go hand in hand. I've got a lot of organizations in towns where they're trying to do road diets, and they need to understand that sometimes a road diet doesn't mean that, or saying no to a road diet doesn't mean that I'm saying yes to freight. It means that freight's going to come through that route anyways. So a road diet is going to create a bottleneck that's going to essentially create an environment that is less safe. And so how do we find a way around a solution that's going to make both parties happy? And it may take years, but let's not do anything that is a knee-jerk reaction politically at a problem that may be the surface problem rather than the root cause.
This is going an entirely different direction than the outline that I had, and I think that it's awesome. So we're gonna roll with it, because you just threw out so much there. One, I have cold sweats. I'm thankful that we're not sitting across the desk from each other, because you'd wonder what's going on. But you gave me flashbacks of the military decision-making process.
Oh, I have something on that. So this is super interesting. Sorry to cut in. But last year, there was an NCHRP study on the decision-making process for DOT secretaries. Really, and that's not for secretaries, but really focusing on the higher echelons of Department of Transportation and the decision-making process. And I was interviewing with a consultant on it, and I was like, I don't understand how you wouldn't just pull in the military decision-making process and MDMP and look at it. And they're like, well, there's a lot of different ways to do it. And I go, but there's a right way. And I mean, having experience with, the Navy's way of doing that from deployment, having experience with how the Air Force does it because of the bosses that I staffed, as well as the Army side from living in that community. I'd pulled from kind of those best practices, and you don't realize how much, I'm sure you're the same way, your mind just thinks that way. It's now trained that that's how you evaluate decisions. And when I say, like, I don't like the courses of action I've been given, everybody now looks at my aeronautics director, who is also military, and they're like, can you just explain this to us? Yes, go talk to Jeremy, and he'll tell you why I'm upset, because the running estimates don't work for me. So yeah.
Also, while you're talking, I hear a lot of you reflecting on utilizing relationships and empathy and understanding and transparency. And you mentioned a situation on how to manage, instead of this being a bill that would have to get submitted, and that is a lengthy process, keeping things at the lowest level possible, using a little backwards planning, but attempting to, instead of creating the division of, now we can't back that up, but we understand what you want to do, and what you want to do is making sense. This is how we can get things to move without having to escalate it up the echelons of command, so to speak. Um, uh, Popular things that we discuss on this podcast is freight security that you're talking about, and you bringing in these bottlenecks and certain events, and how you are collaborating with other state DOT directors, across the United States. That's all fantastic information, and good for me, and probably good for the listeners to understand that, hey, I don't cross state lines, and all of a sudden I'm running into somebody that's entirely different minded, and different rules, different laws. It's a lot of working together, and making things as uniform as possible, with still having the differences. In your position, is your position elected, or are you appointed?
No, that's a great question because it's different across the country. And so I'm
Yeah.
actually appointed. So I'm appointed by an elected body. And so that were the governor, and then confirmed by the legislature. And so that was one thing that really surprised me as I came into the DOT world, was understanding the governance structure was so different in a lot of these states. Texas is highly governed by their transportation commission. Chairman Bug is one of the most influential people within transportation in Texas. You've got Utah, which has had a long-standing DOT director in Carlos Perez. And, that is because he's moved from governor to governor and speaks volumes to the relationships he's built within Utah. And then you have, Russell and Georgia, who has an equal tenure, but his has got the commission structure too. So he doesn't respond the same way to the governor's office. And so it's just quite interesting. And it may be why and this was surprising to me when I came into the CEO role, is because that's what we call ourselves, are the CEOs, because they're either secretaries, directors, CEOs. It's kind of all over the place across the 52. And so it was, shouldn't there be, there's standards for the interstate, there's standards for highways, you've got the green book. So why is there so much difference? And when you think about our most vulnerable time for someone that's driving a truck, snowstorms, or anything that's adverse weather, why isn't there a standardized 511 type format? And why doesn't it go from state to state? Why do you have to go from Iowa's to Nebraska's to Wyoming's? And that's been something we've actually been spending a lot of time on in the last year. As the group, we identified a couple of years ago, what are the key areas where we as an organization really need to invest? And this was one of them. And so I chair the governance committee on the I-80 coalition. And this is really trying to take I-80 and look at it the same way like I-95 has been looked at, and say, what would it look like to create standards of operation? And really, and what I mean by that is driver expectation across the board, really in terms of information. And you can hear it referred to as light up the interstate, but what it really means is standard of practice across I-80, so that you can move freight more efficiently. And so for us, it is understanding the choke points. Where are things as simple as truck parking that we've been trying to tackle for 15 years really a problem? We need to talk more as an organization and less just as states to determine who's going to fix our truck parking problem. Is it going to be the feds, meaning they don't approve truck parking plans, but they do concur to them? Do we need to look at how we spend federal resources there? Do we need to look at a revised approach to our the regulations guiding or rest areas? Or do we need to really lean on the private sector? And in my head, it's a little bit of all three, but heavy on leaning on the private sector for innovation. I don't think this is an area where technology can help you. You don't have to build your way out of it on capacity, but allowing better expectation on what kind of spaces are actually available, what kind of services are actually available where, is helpful. And that has to be in real time. That can't be back, data from November 5th when you're January 22nd trying to get into a spot. It has to be real time data. And, Google's transportation public sector and Kristen White moving over there, I think there's a lot of hope that we'll see those different public sector players start to evolve this and keep us moving forward in this area, while we as a DOT world start to understand what are these standards. And so the FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, just put in a smart grant for Nevada DOT to start looking at this. And Nevada DOT has pledged that money to a I-80 coalition, and that will become the seed money for what will future be a peer exchange, and really looking at peer funds to say, we are invested in this. We see the importance of corridor coalition and driver expectation. But my personal thing on this, and this comes from the background of being a policy person, but then the military piece of, you can't just live in a policy world. There has to be clear outcomes. There has to be clear things that we're working on. And they have to be rooted in problems that truckers are going through every day. And so that's where I think we're going to have some strong public involvement to understand what those needs are and at what level we need to address them. Because the squeaky wheel, a lot of times, gets the attention. And so we want to make sure that when someone says truck parking is a problem, we understand to what extent and where. And so same thing with bottlenecks. Where's the capacity a problem? And if capacity is a problem, can you use technology to get your way out of it? Or do you actually need additional lanes? Do you actually need to look at building your way out of it? And so it's going to be interesting as we look at this as a multi-state coalition. I think that if there's any way you're going to get it done, it's got to be from at least 10 states moving this forward.
That is really, really interesting. There's a lot of things going on here that within our time, we're not going to be able to unpack all of them. But it seems like you were a little bit on the cusp of sharing some recent success stories. Do you have anything or initiatives that you want to highlight and shout out right now that your agency has brought about, or is close to bringing through fruition? You just kind of said something that made me think of a quote from The Mission, the Men, and Me. Always listening to the boots on the ground, right? Having those conversations with the truckers and understanding what they're going. That's their workplace. My office, and when I'm at my customers, when I'm there, that's my workplace. Well, a trucker, they live on the road. They live behind the wheel. In listening to them, and asking them their thoughts, I think that's really great. Anything right now that Nebraska DOT, any success story or initiative you'd like to highlight before maybe we move on to some more challenges and potential solutions?
Yeah, we're in National Work Zone Awareness Week, and so you can't leave this without an opportunity to talk about safety for us. And this is tied back to the military. When I was working for the Senate, we lost quite a few service members. And so as a delegation, a lot of times you work closely with those families. And there was one Marine that I remember quite well. I worked closely with his family, and they didn't want to work with the military. They needed somebody else. And, that will stay with me forever, but I never lost anybody in my unit in a deployment or very, very close to me. We lost some Nebraska National Guard members, but coming to the DOT and losing 2 people in a year, and actually in a month and a half, was incredibly difficult. And it's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. And we had another catastrophic incident where, Bill Devine's still recovering, and we're getting him the help he needs. But to lose Dave Schwartz and Mark Wells within really 6 weeks of each other was so impactful. And it took, you talk about safety. It took talking about safety to a whole new level and saying, like, I'm done talking about it. Like, we need we had already been working on a comprehensive safety bill. We need to really dedicate ourselves and not be afraid of the political whims. And working with the governor's office, we've actually produced a few bills. Now, I got word today that one, the variable speed limits, which is a driver expectation piece for the trucking community, meaning now consistent with Wyoming, we'll be able to have variable speed limits on I-80 so that when we do have adverse weather, we can drop the speed limit so as to create driver expectation across that corridor. But we weren't able to get there with cameras in the work zones. And that might not be popular with your group, but I can tell you that from the studies that we've seen throughout the country, if there's one thing that's going to move the needle, the minute you tell people that there's going to be cameras in the work zones, they start paying attention. And right now, the driver behavior we're seeing, both from carrier enforcement with the AccuSense and watching people literally watch their tablet and watching a movie on it and having pictures of them and not being able to do anything about it, is just deafening in terms of how angry you get. And especially when you see two of your brothers aren't going home to their families. And so we've really tried to have all hands on deck to make sure we can address the safety issue. And so there's strong support in the legislature. It's just trying to get it worded the right way. So we'll come back next year with a revised plan to hopefully get that across the aisle and make sure that both sides agree that this is the right way to address it in the state. But I mean, there's strong programs across the country that are working. And, this is the use of cameras at 11 miles over. It's not as though we're taking photographs of everyone. So we want to get there, but we did have some success with the variable speed limits and, got driver education up. The governor has been supportive of a hands-free bill. And so consistent with the motor carrier side and making sure that you do have your cell phone secured, but you can still do the one tap, you can still do it navigation. So we're trying to work with the legislature on that as well. Where we've seen a ton of success actually under the governor's leadership is in looking at our own environmental practices. So when I was with the organization prior, we did something called NEPA assignment, and it's essentially the assumption of authority under the National Environmental Policy Act. And, we worked on that, passed it in 2019, and we're able to move forward with assignment for about 96% of our environmental permitting. So we essentially act as the federal government at DOT. And we did it with very little additional resources. So we control our own destiny. And it has been extremely successful. And we've been holding on what we want to do on 327, which would be full assignment. But because of the success we've had at the state level with passing 1335, which is essentially excluding the public right-of-way from NESCA, which is our Environmental Policy Act, and saying that the transportation right-of-way is not considered critical habitat, we're now seeing the federal government pick up on that same common sense approach and applying that in executive orders. And so as we start to look at seeing like what can be done both on the state side and the federal side to make projects be smoother and go faster, we're out in front of that. We passed 1335 last year. This year, we're getting ready to pass, or hopeful to pass in lieu fee so that we can mitigate a little bit more efficiently. And why all this is an issue is we have a threatened species that covers about a third of our state that came up from Oklahoma. It's migrating up and will soon be in South Dakota. And the only approved mitigation strategy for it is putting land in a conservation easement in perpetuity.
It's not armadillos, is it?
No, it's it's the burying beetle, the American burying beetle. And so this species was actually downlisted. And so when it was downlisted, you would think that, hey, we're creating a net benefit to the species. It's no longer endangered. Why would mitigation strategies get more strict? That doesn't make any sense. And now you're saying we can't do anything but put land in a conservation easement in perpetuity. That's not very popular in Cherry County. and it sure as hell won't be popular in South Dakota. So how do we find innovative ways to really push through this? And so that it common sense, because that doesn't make sense to anybody I've talked to. And so we've really laid the groundwork at the state level for the federal government under the Trump administration to pick up on and run. And so we're very hopeful that we see some real permitting reform that brings common sense approach.
That's a lot. You made a comment there, and I want to go back and hit on it. The safe work zones, that's a huge topic that we discuss on this podcast. And I love a lot of what I heard you say. And yeah, as being a guy that works for a company, these cameras in the work zone, I'd like to learn a lot more about that before I can even give a personal opinion of it. But we're big pushers, and we really like the insurance policy, is what we refer to it as cameras in the cab. It has been beneficial so much more, and it was extremely unpopular when it came out, but those in-cab cameras and those systems and the one touch, the technology that is really getting in there when it comes to work zones, we are all about the reduced speed. And those folks, you heard me talk about their place of work, that's their office. And uh, I can feel in our listeners don't get to see your face, but I could see it that you hurt even mentioning their names and the loss of your coworkers. And so I very much respect that, and I feel for it. And so whatever we have to do for people to be able to go to work and go home in the same condition and show back up to work in the same condition, I think is a positive step. A lot of these other things, your variable speed zones across interstates, it seems like you guys are really moving. And I had a question of how do you prioritize all of these ideas, all of these collective things? Well, in some form or fashion, you are prioritizing and working towards execution, and that's the name of the game. You're looking at it, and you're probably in some form or fashion figuring out financially, how do we do this? How do we roll it out over periods of time? Because we don't all just have blank checks. So I'm starting this to lead into a type of funding question. And again, I've already disclosed. You answer what you're comfortable answering from your seat. But, how does your funding for your projects, where does it originate from?
Sure. And this is something that I don't know if everyone understands, because I don't think I understood it to the depth that I do now, even 2-3 years ago. And every state is different. Their revenue sources are diverse. Transportation organizations have gotten smarter, whether they be local entities, municipals, or states, have gotten smarter with understanding that they need to subsidize their income and their revenue outside of just user fees. Because we haven't raised the gas tax since 93, excuse me, the federal gas tax since 93, the Highway Trust Fund isn't capable of supporting our needs anymore. And you saw that with IIJA, the Highway Trust Fund was not even capable of supporting all the formula programs, let alone the discretionary programs. You had to use advanced appropriations to cover at least 2 of the buckets of formula and new buckets of formula. And so for a state DOT, we've got to look at two different things. You got to look at how much are they federally funded. So, compare Nebraska to Utah. Utah they do not depend on their state funding. We do. Look at Tennessee. Tennessee's passed a $3 billion backlog, almost $4 billion now. Missouri, they got $3 billion going on I-70. States have recognized that the help that they get from the federal government is not enough, and they've got to take the measures to find revenue sources from the state level that align with transportation that they can put to work. And part of that is because the economic growth in some of these states is so significant that if they waited on their formula allocation that came from the Highway Trust Fund, there's no way that they could ever keep up. And a lot of these states, we prided ourselves with being pay-as-you-go states. And I fully support being responsible stewards of taxpayer money. Absolutely. But it is not responsible when your highway program is $700 million and you've got a $300 million job and you're going to try to save up all your cash for so many years to be able to build that. That's not responsible. You're keeping cash in the bank in order to do that. That's not the way anybody works. That's not the way a mortgage works. And so, the first thing that we did when I got back was pass bonding. And we did it responsibly with really clear guidelines in place that allowed us to bring cash in when we needed to, when we had a significant project. Now 275, which is a major corridor for our communities, both commuter traffic from Norfolk to Omaha, as well as freight going up to Northeast Nebraska, they're going to have us off that road and that project complete at least 4 years faster, if not 5. And it could be 6 because who knows what kind of funding issues we're going to run into. So now we've safeguarded that corridor. And so when anybody asks me about transportation funding, it's first like, what context? Is it a state? Okay, how have they diversified their revenue? In Nebraska, we've got motor vehicle registration. We've got motor vehicle sales tax. We've got motor vehicle fuel. So your ability to actually collect from gas tax at the state level. And we also have in place something that on a policy side is incredibly helpful, which is the variable. And we can adjust the gas tax a slight amount in order to generate enough revenue to meet the legislatively approved highway cash fund allocation. That saved us during COVID and allowed us to not create a backlog of lost revenue because we were able to adjust. And that doesn't mean it always goes up. Sometimes it comes down because we're collecting too much. If we're selling a lot of vehicles, if there's a lot of incentives, that mean that we can actually drop the gas tax for half a year. And so we can move it that way. We also have an electric vehicle surcharge that's in place, as well as electric vehicle registration. And so the caution I always put is people believe that you can plug this hole with electric vehicle charging fees, and that's not it. We've been in this problem for 15 years and we're just now getting attention because of EVs. But because vehicles have become more fuel efficient, we have just been steadily growing in a deficit in the Highway Trust Fund. And so we've got to figure out at the national level the same thing that we've done at the state levels, which is a true, honest conversation about the fact that user fees are not going to pay for infrastructure or all of it. And we've got to figure out what that right mix is. And I do think that innovative finance, meaning like using public-private partnerships, using tolling options, needs to be looked at, but it's not going to be the answer for everything. You've got to have the right level of traffic. You've got to have new infrastructure. Everything's got to kind of come in line to have that be a true responsible approach. But that option has to be there. And so for Nebraska, we're doing 2 things. It was, what's the actual gap? So we think we're short, but validate that gap. And so we validated that gap with the help of the governor's office to say that gap right now, because of the buying power and the 15% inflation we've seen, essentially ate that increase that we got from IIJA on our formula funds. So we are essentially right now at about $130 to $150 million gap. If you want to say, if these are the projects the legislature wants us to build out in this time frame, and this is how much maintenance we need to be able to doing to keep our roads at this level of condition, well, this is how much money we need. There's $130 to $150 million gap. Now we're on our 3rd year of that, and you know how gaps go. And so, but the maintenance and the numbers don't catch up until about 3 years later. And so though, if you look at our NSI, or Nebraska Serviceability Index, you're going to say, wow, Vicki, you've got great roads. And I'm going to say, yeah, right now I do. Because the money we programmed 3 years ago is finally kind of getting out there. And the $70 million that the legislature and the governor led the way with getting us on ARPA funds is going to do some real work on some of these spurs, which were bad. But it's going to take me 2 years to even fix this problem legislatively. And it's going to take me another 3 years to catch up. And our numbers are probably going to be record low. And so it's forecasting out. It's doing those running estimates, right? From the military side to say like, hey, what do we actually need? And what is our combat power going to have to be in order to actually succeed? And right now there's a huge deficit that we've identified. And so we're working with the legislature. There's a bill in this year to run a task force to help us validate that number with the help of some of our elected partners, and then move forward with a potential bill.
Well, I think they have the right person in place. I cannot thank you enough for your time. You are super busy. When all the dates we tried to get to work to come together, and they changed a few times. And thanks for being Semper Gumby. For the listeners, that's always flexible. I really, really appreciate you expanding from the normal population. And I know that you see this and you understand it. We just get so frustrated when things don't change as fast as we want them to. All we can look at sometimes is, how am I affected? Well, the tax man keeps taking my taxes. I expect the roads to be perfect. I expect no slowdowns on the road. And doggone it, I'm passing another oversized load here. I'm in another congestion area. And it seems like I-35 in Oklahoma has never in my 43 years of life not had construction on it. And it makes us really question what the heck's going on. And so for me, I'm thankful to know that there's people like you that are in these leadership positions and you're working on it and you are stressed about it, and there's many things that all have to come together for this stuff to happen. And so I know that you didn't get to meet my other counterparts, Kenny Ray and Mike Bohan and Barry Harrison. They are the true DOT professionals of this. But thank you for entertaining me and our listeners. I'll close us out here, but do you have any parting thoughts or main takeaways that you'd like the listeners to hear before we go?
Yeah, I'll start with the policy piece and then kind of end with a personal ask. You know, we are at a time where we are going to go through transportation law again, and we're in the process of rewriting the reauthorization for the surface transportation bill, which is a great opportunity for different advocacy groups to get out and support their organizations. And so as different groups have complaints or opportunities to improve, this is a great time to engage with your DOT or with your legislative member. This is going to be a more comprehensive approach than IIJA was, and the administration has promised to really sit down and listen. And so we're hopeful, from everything from, truck parking to permitting reform, that we can get into policy some of the advancements that we think are needed, as well as create the flexibility that's going to allow states to actually see some real change. And that's what's been so difficult, is not having a standardization of flexibility across the states, and specific to, our local regulatory offices, whether they be the Federal Highway or Corps of Engineers and whatnot. And so we're really hoping to have that standardization kind of laid out. And for me, that means specifically an emergency response. How do we make sure that the response to Hurricane Helene that happened in North Carolina is the same response and answers that they're getting in South Carolina and Florida and other places? And so we really want to bring some of that emergency management piece forward in that policy area, as well as on the safety side, really try to figure out how to improve driver behavior. And we can't do that, in my opinion, without it becoming personal to everyone. And really getting people to take that pledge to buckle up and put their phone down, because it gets taught. Your kids see it, you model it every day. And if we can figure out how to get flexibility with NHTSA funding to make sure that we can put that driver education funding to work in areas that we feel it's going to actually move the needle, we as states should have that opportunity. And so I think the last thing I would say is just please understand that safety is a personal commitment. And the same thing that we say in the military, right? The more comfortable you get, the more dangerous you are. And we had a situation in Nebraska where we lost a state trooper, and, we've just got to get back to the point where safety leads our daily lives every day.
Thank you for that message. Thank you, listeners, for joining us today. Take part in National Safety Month. And I will join you again on the next episode of Driving the Line, the podcast that is always in the pursuit of safety.
That's all the time we have for this edition of Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Until the next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.